I was traveling cross country to see my family. I live in Texas, and I was driving to New York for a couple weeks. The reason I drive is because I can't do planes. I've been on a few, but I end up having hour-long panic attacks, and it's just too much for me to handle. Plus, I enjoy driving. I'm a big fan of true crime documentaries, and there are hours upon hours of podcasts to keep me entertained. I had been driving for about 10 hours, and I stopped to fill my gas tank. It was around dusk and the sun had just gone down, and the area I was in wasn't too busy. I pulled up to the pump and checked my phone for a couple minutes, responding to texts and whatnot. As I go to open my door to fill my tank, I nearly scream as I see this big, ugly guy with a gray beard staring at me into my car. I had no idea where he came from, so I rolled my window down a little to see what he wanted. He asked me, "Fill her up?" And I just looked back at him, kind of confused. He put his hand out as if he were expecting something. Then I felt like a complete idiot, since I had realized that this place must have been a full-service gas station, which for those that don't know, it's when the gas station employees fill your tank for you. I just laughed and rummaged through my purse for my credit card and said, "Yeah, fill her up." He took my card and swiped it, and began pumping and handed my card back. He stood there next to my window, staring off in another direction. It was kind of uncomfortable, to be honest. Something about this guy just seemed sketchy. It was then that I noticed that other cars had pulled up, and he hadn't gone to pump their gas for them. In fact, it appeared everyone was pumping their own. I must have made it obvious that I'd realized this, due to me jerking my head around, looking at everyone and gasping. The man just put his hand up to the glass and said, "Relax, I just wanted to help you out. A pretty young girl like you shouldn't have to pump her own gas." I had about lost it at that. I managed to keep a lid on my emotions and I ignored him. I then heard the pump click to indicate my tank was full. I held my breath as he slowly lumbered over to take it out. The second my gas cap was secured, I started my car and put it in drive and peeled out before we even had a chance to put the pump back in its holder. I jumped onto the highway without looking back. After a few minutes, I managed to calm myself down a bit, and I slowed from 90 to 70. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted, since this guy technically didn't do anything wrong. Maybe he really was just some guy that didn't realize how creepy he'd come off. Eventually, I managed to reason with myself that had he in fact had bad intentions, he literally could have walked off with my credit card and I'd have not noticed in time. As I started to think about pulling off for the night, I was the only car on the highway, aside from a pair of headlights around a mile behind me. It was late. I pulled off at the next exit and stopped at this little 24-hour motel and got myself a room. I didn't even lay down for more than a minute before I was out like a light. I must have slept for an hour or two before I woke up to a breeze hitting my face. I sat up and looked at the wide open window right next to my bed. All of a sudden, I didn't feel so alone. I was surprisingly calm. I didn't feel the urge to scream or run or make any sudden movements. I just got up and went to close the window, and I was then going to head to the front desk to complain. As I walked by my bed, I felt a hand wrap around my ankle and tug me so hard I almost fell over. "Come on, Miranda, I just want to be a gentleman," I heard a familiar voice sputter. All of the calmness I felt before was gone. I screamed as loud as I could, and I jumped up and ran out of the room and right to the front desk. I tried to explain everything that happened as best as I could, and I pleaded for them to call the police, that there was an intruder under my bed. They looked at me like they would a child crying about a monster in the closet, and the guy at the desk said he'd check it out. I begged him to just call 911, but he insisted I must have been imagining it. When he walked in the room, the man was gone, but the window was still wide open. He said he would check the security cameras and to lock the windows and try to get back to sleep. I was speechless. I took it upon myself to get the police involved, so now that I was back in my room, I used my own phone to call. They arrived shortly after and I met them in the lobby. I explained everything from the guy pumping my gas to the lone car on the highway behind me to the motel incident, and they were able to write up a report. But since there was no solid evidence or proof of anything, reality hit hard. All they told me was to keep an eye out and to not hesitate to call again if I needed to. That was enough for me though, because I hopped back in my car and took off once again. I'd check my rearview mirror every 10 seconds and would get super paranoid every time I'd see a passing car, but thankfully nobody ended up following me. I ended up having a wonderful time with my family once I had arrived, and to be honest, I think my brain blocked it out for a while. But whenever I'm at a gas station, I always triple check my surroundings before opening my door. It was a Friday afternoon during late summer. I was in my last period class with my friend Kirk. It was a study hall period, where normally everyone would have to do homework, but instead we all played on our phones and talked about weekend plans or whatever. Kirk and I grew up together as neighbors and naturally spent all of our time hanging out, so we talked about what we planned to do that afternoon. Now, keep in mind, we were only freshmen at the time, so we were only able to go where our bikes could take us. We also lived in a rural part of town, so at our age, we had to kind of make our own fun. We did the typical bonfires and camping so much that it had started to get boring after a while. So by the time the bell had rung to send us home, we hadn't come up with any plans. The night basically went uneventful for the most part. We ordered a pizza and just played Halo and drank soda and felt bad about ourselves. I was getting ready to head out after the end of that round when Kirk suddenly paused the game and looked at me with the expression he makes when he has a good idea. "What?" I asked. "Those abandoned mills that we found a couple years ago," he said. "We're exploring them." "Damn, alright, that's not a bad idea," I said. He ran to his room to get some flashlights and came back a minute later with a Ouija board. I laughed since I knew his family was pretty religious and I didn't think he'd even own one of those. We hopped on our bikes and headed toward the mills. For a bit of backstory, we found these mills a while before, and they're right off this bike path that runs through our area. There were like 4 buildings, all of them were boarded up and padlocked. There were still plenty of ways people had broken in over the years though, so we imagined we'd bust through a window or something. Another sort of eerie detail is that the building we planned to explore had been on fire a few years before. There were arson watch posters littered around the area, but since it was made of brick, the structure itself was still intact. We approached the buildings, and I got that butterfly feeling in my stomach of nervousness and excitement. It was this perfectly creepy silence, and to add to it, there was a streetlight flickering. We crept around for a little bit, scoping out the area. Half of one of the buildings had completely caved in from the fire, and it looked like it hadn't been touched. It was just a big pile of burnt rubble. The other half of it was all charred and burnt, with the windows boarded up and covered in graffiti. But to our surprise, as we walked around each of the buildings, it didn't seem like there were any openings. Then we came across a metal door that for sure had to be locked, but I just gave it a good yank, and sure enough it opened. A big gust of musty air hit us like a truck. We looked at each other and grinned as we turned our flashlights on. As we walked around, the floor creaked and made all sorts of unsettling noises. There was a hallway that we went down that led to a big open area the size of like a school gymnasium, and it appeared to be primarily where the fire had taken place. The walls and the ceiling were just black and burnt, and everything was wet, presumably from the rainstorm from a couple nights earlier. It smelled so bad, like a basement that hadn't been touched in a decade. Wet burnt wood as well as mold and rot. Panning our lights around, we saw old textile-looking machines and just boxes of whatever else they had. We didn't look. But what else we saw, littered on the floor, were teddy bears. At least 50 teddy bears just strewn around. I looked at Kirk, who was looking back at me. "Dude, what the shit is all of this?" I said. I didn't know whether to be freaked out or to find it funny. Kirk didn't seem to think it was funny though. In this horrifyingly calm voice, he just said, "Something isn't right. We shouldn't be here, man." I just saw it as probably some kids that thought it would be funny to creep someone out, but I wasn't certain. I convinced Kirk to stay to at least explore the room that we were in. We tiptoed around, trying to be careful as to not fall through the floor, since, the building at one point was engulfed in flames. Aside from the teddy bears and stacks of old boxes, there wasn't much else to see. I had pretty much had enough at this point, so I called out to Kirk to leave. I couldn't see where he had gone though. I walked around slowly, peering around each box carefully. I thought that if I played my cards right, I could scare the living hell out of him. I was by the back wall of the room, and outside of my flashlight beam I could see Kirk crouched under a table. I caught on and realized he was probably going to try and scare me too, so I pretended I didn't notice him and kept walking. I'd call out his name every so often just to keep it going. I was about 20 feet from the table Kirk was under when I saw a light beam go by on the other side of the room. I froze where I was standing. That meant that whoever was under the table wasn't Kirk, or at least I thought, because when I shone my light to the table, sure enough, Kirk was crouched in a ball, shaking. He waved his hand over his mouth to shush and turn my light off. I got down and crawled over to where he was. He managed to whisper ever so quietly that he saw a man dressed up in some weird bear costume sleeping, the head of the costume on the ground next to him. The man must have heard him, because he saw him sit up and turn on a light of his own. That was all Kirk managed to get out before we saw the light coming in our direction. Before we had a chance to think about a thing, Kirk jumped up and grabbed my arm and dragged me to my feet. He yelled, "Run," as he took off for the door. I was right behind him as we navigated the boxes and teddy bears trying to get to the exit. Right before we left, I did something ballsy and turned around and shined the light back into the room. The man was standing at the end, this time with the mask on. It had these big ears and was just a bigger version of the teddy bears littered all over the floor. He bellowed out this disgusting attempt at, I guess, a bear's growl, but whatever it was scared me enough to slam the door and take off. We got back on our bikes and rode back home, not looking back. We were able to laugh about it after, and we figured it was some teenager trying to get a laugh. Unfortunately, we'll never know the true story behind the guy in the teddy bear costume, because a couple years later we went back, and this time all the buildings were torn down. This story takes place a few years ago. I was a college student, and I lived at home and commuted to school. I spent a lot of time in my room, which was in the basement of my house, doing homework or studying. Most days, both my parents worked till nighttime, my dad being a cop and my mom being a waitress, so when I was home, I was usually alone. I woke up on a Monday morning and headed off to school. I had a few big exams I had been preparing for, so I was exhausted from all the studying and preparing I had done. I took my exams, headed home, and crashed on my bed downstairs. I made sure to lock both locks on the front and back doors, both doorknob and deadbolt, because if not, my mom would throw a fit. Years ago, our house got broken into with her being home and literally traumatized my poor mother to the point where she's constantly paranoid about it happening again. Anyways, I fell asleep and dozed off instantly. I was woken to the sounds of footsteps above me. My house is really old, so most of the time the floor is creaky as hell. To be honest, I was used to getting woken up this way. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, assuming it was one of my parents getting ready for bed. But the way the footsteps slowly crept around above me, it was almost like they were trying not to be heard. I went to grab my phone to ask my parents what they were doing, and the clock read 6:34 p.m. Neither of them ever got home earlier than 8. I froze. Since I was in the basement, I had no windows, so no way to tell the time of day. I went onto the Life 360 app to check their locations, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw neither of their locations at my house. It was at this point I called the cops, saying there was an intruder in the house. Whoever was upstairs must have heard me, because I heard the steps above me go quiet. About 10 minutes later, I heard a loud banging at the front door, and a man's voice yelling that he was the police. And before anyone says anything about if my dad shows up since he's a cop, he didn't, because he isn't a cop in our hometown. Anyways, I bolted up the stairs and unlocked the front door to quickly let them in. I explained the footsteps and how I was home alone. I showed them where I heard it, and they proceeded to search the house. To my relief, they found no signs of whoever it was. They said the intruder must have left, and that there wasn't much they could do. They left, and I locked the door behind them as they walked out. I went back downstairs, and I obviously wasn't able to fall back asleep after this, so I just watched TV with the volume on low. I was watching some cartoon, I think regular show, when all of a sudden I had a horrifying realization. I ran upstairs and checked the back door, and sure enough, both doorknob and deadbolt were how I left them, locked. It isn't possible for someone to lock a deadbolt from the outside without a key, which we don't even have any spare keys. That meant that whoever was inside never left. That also meant that they were in the house before I even got home, which meant they knew that I was home. Pure panic set in, and I bolted outside and sprinted to the neighbor's house and begged them to call the cops again for me. They did, and once again the police showed up at my house. I told them how I think the person's still inside and to have them search the house again. While this was going on, my dad came home, and he ran out of his car and sprinted over to me, asking if I was okay and what was going on. I told him about the potential intruder as I started to cry. I think he went in to help the officers look, and around 10 minutes later I heard yelling and a big commotion, and pretty soon the cops came out with some kid, maybe 18 or 19, in handcuffs. He looked like your typical gamer nerd, but looking at him sent a chill down my spine. There was something about him that was just evil and gross. His long greasy hair and pit stains made me want to puke. He didn't even look at me as the police walked him past. As he did, the smell hit me. It was the most rancid a person could smell. It was clear this kid was a freak. It turns out he had been hiding in my parents' closet, in some discreet storage compartment buried behind a bunch of clothes. It wasn't something you'd probably find unless you were looking for it, which was why they didn't find him the first time. Inside was a bunch of my mom's socks and underwear. I don't think I need to go into further detail on that. We still don't know how he got in or how long he'd been in there for. It's really something that's better off not being known. And as you might imagine, my mom was completely devastated by this incident, and her fear of an intruder has been relit and is stronger than ever. So thanks to that freak show, my parents decided it would be best to move out, and not even a month later, I said goodbye to my childhood home, leaving behind a lot of amazing memories, as well as a horrible one too.